My life took a drastic turn when I was 22 years old. My name is Ethan Carter. I discovered early on in my Montgomery, Texas, upbringing that family wasn't always about love and support. My mother, Linda Carter, was more concerned with maintaining appearances than caring for her children. And my father, Frank Carter, operated a small hardware business. Then came their golden child, my brother Jacob, who was 2 years older than me and incapable of wrongdoing. In contrast, I was merely an afterthought and a target for their jokes and anger. My dad used to call me a waste of space, lethargic, and useless. Following in my father's footsteps, my brother treated me as if I were inconsequential. What about my mom? She merely observed, making feeble objections that were never taken seriously. I had accepted my place in the family by the time I turned 22. I did the hardest labor for the least amount of money in my dad's hardware store. My father made it plain that college is for people who can afford to be useless. He believed that I was only useful while I was working for him, under his control. So I was never able to pursue a college education, not because I lacked motivation. I should have realized something was wrong when my dad abruptly said, "We were going to Colorado for my uncle's wedding." We weren't the type of family that traveled or took vacations. Unless it was only for show, we hardly ever ate supper together. I went along against my better judgment, nevertheless. The hellish road trip, like most things in my family, the vacation began tensely. During the first day, Jacob and my father made jokes about me. Jacob chuckled from the front seat. "I bet Ethan couldn't figure out how to get out of a paper bag." My father went on to say, "He has the survival instincts of a houseplant." As usual, my mother simply groaned and urged them to stop, but her words were meaningless. By the third day, I was mentally and physically exhausted. We pulled into a rest area in the middle of nowhere, probably in Colorado. After hours of driving, a dilapidated restroom structure and a vending machine that appeared to have been empty for many years were the only indications of life in one of those areas. I muttered, massaging the stiffness in my neck, "I need to stretch my legs." Since no one recognized me, I simply left. My phone was charging in the car, so I left it there. Why wouldn't I have taken my wallet? All I wanted to do was use the restroom. I spent 15 minutes indoors. Our automobile was gone when I left, squinting in the blazing Colorado heat. The understanding I initially believed it to be a joke. My father shook his head as if I were foolish for falling for it, and my brother smiled foolishly as I strolled around the rest stop, expecting to see the car parked nearby. However, nothing was present. There was only a spooky silence and an empty parking lot. I waited. 30 minutes passed. An hour went by. Truckers, families, and tourists taking short breaks were among the people that came and left. No one questioned me, but several others looked at me curiously. Then, at last, I realized. They had no intention of returning. When your own blood betrays you, what do? I briefly pondered using a stranger's phone to make a call to them out of desperation. Perhaps that was an error. Perhaps they didn't realize I wasn't in the car as they drove away. But then I heard Jacob chuckling in my mind. I bet he's freaking out right now. My dad's icy, contemptuous tone. He'll figure it out, if he's not as dumb as he looks. My mother's feeble and ineffective protest. "Frank, are you sure?" All of a sudden, a lifetime of being treated like nothing returned. After that, I made a decision. I had no intention of begging. I had no intention of pursuing them. I approached a middle-aged mother who had just gotten out of her minivan with her 2 children. I said, "Excuse me," in a firm voice. "My family had an emergency and had to leave suddenly. I need to get into town. Would you be able to give me a ride?" She paused, her gaze searching me for danger. However, I must have appeared innocuous enough, just a youngster left at a rest area, dressed in torn trousers and a beat-up Metallica t-shirt. She paused, then nodded. "That's why I phoned a homeless shelter 40 miles away in Grand Junction, rather than my relatives." Although I had no idea what lay ahead, I was certain that I would not be returning. My thoughts were racing as I sat in the back seat of the minivan and gazed out at the boundless Colorado fields. In an attempt to strike up a conversation, the woman I subsequently found out her name was Janet asked if I had any relatives in Grand Junction. "Yeah," I told a lie. "They'll be meeting me there." I didn't require sympathy. She didn't have to contact the police or promise to phone my relatives on my behalf. Hearing my father's voice begging me to quit embarrassing him was the last thing I wanted. Janet gave me a final worried glance before leaving me at a modest communal shelter downtown. I turned toward the building after waiting until her van vanished around the corner. A reminder of reality. There wasn't much shelter. There are rows of cots in a converted church, and the air is heavy with the smell of antiseptic and aged wood. A man in his 50s with broad shoulders and a graying beard at the front desk glanced up from a clipboard. Dave was the name on his name tag. He remarked, You look lost, kid. I paused. How could you possibly describe such a thing? Instead, I uttered, my wallet suffered theft. I just need somewhere to crash for a couple of nights while I get my ID replaced. Dave looked at me as if he had heard the same story 100 times before. Perhaps he had. He handed me a clipboard and stated, beds are first come, first served. Fill this out. I lay on a cot in a room full of other lost souls that night. 2 beds over, a man snored. The man whispered into a cell phone. With my stomach churning from hunger, I gazed at the ceiling. I had nothing. I have no money or identification, no contacts. And I felt the weight of it for the first time since leaving that rest stop. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as it began to sneak in. I wasn't planning. I had no notion what the future held. However, I was aware of one thing. I was not returning. Mode of survival in the morning. I had a strategy. Step 1. Find employment. Anything under the table was my best option, because I didn't yet have identification. I checked every cafe, gas station, and convenience shop with a help wanted sign as I strolled around Grand Junction's downtown. When they learned I didn't have identification, the majority turned me away. Then I entered Sonny's, a little, dilapidated diner. Geraldine, the proprietor, was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver-flecked hair, a sleeve of tattoos, and a glass-breaking attitude. She looked at me from behind the desk and said, "What can you do?" Saying, "I can wash dishes, I work hard. I just need a shot." Geraldine gave a snort. "You steal from me, you're dead. Start now." Unexpectedly, the first secured a job. We paid it in cash. It wasn't much, only enough for a bus pass and a few inexpensive dinners, but it was something. When I returned to the shelter that evening, I sat at an outdated desktop computer and looked up all the steps I needed to take to get a new ID online. I discovered that I required an address in order to acquire my birth certificate online. Dave, the shelter guy, gave me permission to use the PO box. First step, completed. Step 2, look for lodging. I needed something better, but the refuge was only temporary. While looking through Craigslist advertising for inexpensive rooms, I discovered that a security deposit of at least $200 would be required. That was far from me. I wasn't going to give up though. The call that made all the difference: I got a cheap pay-as-you-go burner phone from Walmart, and 7 days after my family abandoned me at that rest stop, it rang. "Unknown figure." I replied. The voice was shrill and desperate as my mother said, "Sal Salvador? Oh my God, is that you?" I remained silent. "We've been looking everywhere. Where are you? Are you safe?" In the background, I could hear my father's irate yet unsurprised voice. "Tell him to stop being dramatic and get his ass to Uncle Rick's." My brother's laughing followed. "Dude, it was just a joke. Chill out. We were going to come back." I inhaled deeply as my fingers clenched around the phone. I may return. I could give them the victory. Or I could decide for myself. With a firm voice I asked, "You wanted to see if I could make it on my own? Then watch me." I then hung up. I banned every family number I could think of as a precaution. I slept better that night than I had in years. Brick by brick, the weeks that followed blended together. I washed dishes till my hands were raw, while working double shifts at Sonny's. I saved every dime I could and ate inexpensive sandwiches at the gas station. My birth certificate came 3 weeks later. I rode a bus to the DMV a week later, had the longest wait of my life, and left with a new state ID. Step 2, completed. I had enough money for a $300 down payment on a studio apartment, above a laundromat a month after I was dumped. The hot water seldom worked, the walls were thin, and it was small. But it was mine. I had a home for the first time in my life. They didn't think I would prevail. I would occasionally read my old email late at night. My mother left the following messages: "Please come home. We're sorry. Your dad didn't mean it." From my dad: "Enough of this childish stunt. Come back before you embarrass us anymore." From Jacob: "Dude, you're such a drama queen." I never answered. Because I got up every morning, went to my job washing dishes, and began building my life. One brick at a time, in my small apartment. My father thought I was a useless son, but I wasn't. My brother didn't use me as the subject of his jokes. My mother always treated me like an afterthought, but I wasn't. I had freedom. And that? I could never get anything from them that was worth that much. The days stretched into weeks. Months after, I woke up every morning to the fragrance of fabric softener from the laundry downstairs in my small studio apartment. I worked double shifts at Sonny's every day, cleaning dishes, sanitizing greasy counters, and becoming familiar with the workings of a kitchen. I had a job. I came to my rescue. I made it through. Surviving, however, was insufficient. The initial indications of change: my employer, Geraldine, looked up at me one evening after a long 12-hour shift when she was tallying out my nightly earnings. As she stuffed cash into an envelope and slid it across the counter, she questioned, "You ever think about doing more than washing dishes?" I blinked. Like what? One of the line cooks was plating a burger at the grill, and she motioned toward it. Cooking. Prepping. Something where you're not breaking your damn back for pennies. It nearly made me chuckle. Preparing food. My dad would have laughed at the notion. He always emphasized, real men work with their hands, referring to manual labor rather than serving food. However, why should I give a damn about his thoughts anymore? Yeah, I replied as I picked up the envelope. I think I'd like that. Getting up the ladder, it wasn't easy to learn how to cook. I almost lost a fingertip the first time I attempted to chop onions. When I attempted to flip an egg for the first time, I succeeded in sending one flying across the kitchen and into Geraldine's coffee cup. But I persisted. I diligently studied various aspects such as timing, sauces, and knife skills. Geraldine would give you a chance if she saw effort, but she had no tolerance for ineptitude. She allowed me to work the grill on slow nights, 6 months after I started working at Sonny's. I worked as a line cook for a year, and I felt like I was good at something for the first time in my life. A life that goes beyond survival. I ought to have been pleased. I lived alone, I have a stable job. Nobody is in charge of me. But hunger was one thing, loneliness was quite another. During shift changes, my coworkers would nod at me and engage in small talk, but I had no pals. Nobody to return home to. On the first Thanksgiving after my abandonment, I ate a turkey sandwich from a gas station while browsing Instagram. I was surrounded by images of joyful families, holiday feasts, and laughter. It didn't matter, I told myself. I would have been better off without them. However, that was untrue. Kendra, then she entered Sonny's one day. She had a medical textbook twice as large as her purse, a disheveled ponytail, and weary eyes. Sitting at the counter, she ordered a Denver omelet with extra coffee and no tomatoes, then ignored it entirely, as she studied. I had witnessed individuals lose themselves in literature before, but never to this extent. Her eyes were fixed on her books as she halted in the middle of biting, the fork just millimeters from her mouth. I once timed her. Before realizing her eggs were cold, she sat in that position for 7 minutes and 23 seconds. It turned into a game. She would come in every Tuesday and Thursday, order the same thing, and I would find some stupid excuse to chat with her. One day, I said, "Hey," as I put down her coffee. "You know your omelet's cold, right?" "What?" she asked, blinking up at me. "You've been holding that bite for 5 minutes." She glanced at her fork. "Oh." Then she gave me a real glance for the first time. She said, "You spell your name weird," gesturing to my name badge. I looked down. I had forgotten that Geraldine had made up a name for me. It now reads Salvador rather than Salvador. "It's a typo," one mentioned. She grinned. "Sure it is." When she returned, my name badge said Salvador. Next, Salvador. Next, not Salvador. She would always smirk, roll her eyes, and point it out. It was the most foolish flirting ever. However, it was successful. She arrived late one evening and was worn out. "Study group bailed on me," she murmured as she used her phone to browse. "I had a reservation at Antonio's, but I don't want to go alone." I quickly untied my kitchen towel, wiped my hands on my apron, and said, "I'll go with you." Startled, she looked up. "You? Unless you want to eat alone." She paused. Then she grinned, which surprised me. "Fine. But if you ruin my favorite pizza place, I'm never coming back to Sonny's." Not just to cook, everything was altered by Kendra. I wanted more because of her. To truly live, not merely to endure. She questioned me about things that no one had ever inquired. "What do you want to do with your life?" I had never considered it. Not at all. My primary objective for so long was to get away. Right now, I had nothing to say. "Well," she observed one evening while looking through my prior pay stubs, "you basically run that place for Geraldine. Why not do it for yourself?" That stayed with me. "Are you a business owner?" Me? For years, my father had been instilling in me the belief that I was not intelligent, competent, or good enough. However, Kendra had faith in me. And perhaps, just possibly, I had faith in myself as well. A divergence in direction. One lazy afternoon, 2 years after my abandonment, Geraldine took me aside. "I'm thinking about opening a second location," she stated. I gave a nod. "Cool." She folded her arms. "I want you to run it." I went cold. She meant it. I stayed up all night looking at the ceiling. I considered how my dad would chuckle if he found out. How he would laugh and claim that I was only making things worse. I reflected on Kendra, and how she had faith in me, despite my lack of it. I also considered the life I desired. This is a true life. Not merely getting by, but flourishing. Yes, I replied. Get even by living well. The 6 months that followed were terrible. I almost broke down 3 times, worked crazy hours, and hardly slept. However, as soon as Sunny's East doors opened and the first customer entered, I heard the register ding. It was worthwhile. For this reason, I owned this. I had created something for the first time in my life. Not because I was ordered to. I didn't have to. However, I did so because I wanted to. What's the best part? Without them, I had completed it. Without my dad's consent. Without the jeering of my brother. Without the feeble, meaningless excuses from my mother. They had tossed me aside as if I were unimportant. I wasn't anything though. I was everything that they had never imagined me to be. I wasn't done yet, either. Years went by. Sunny's East was successful. It was a simple, reliable place where people came to dine, laugh, and feel at home. Not some grand, ostentatious empire. Although I wasn't wealthy, I also wasn't living on the streets. Kendra was a medical school graduate. We had relocated to a modest yet cozy home that seemed like our own. I felt at home for the first time in my life. Joyful. Until the past interrupted. The word that revolutionized everything, a LinkedIn notification, was the first step. Alan Matthews viewed your profile 27 times today. My heart stopped beating. It had been more than 10 years since I last spoke to my brother. Since that last phone call, when I told my family to watch me survive, I hadn't spoken to them. I gazed at the little representation of his face on the screen, which was older but still recognizable. Why on earth did he want it? It didn't take me long to learn. A week later, a Facebook profile with an unfamiliar name sent me a friend request. There was a message attached. Salvador. It's Uncle Rick. Your mom gave me your old email, but it bounced back. Are you okay? Your dad has been asking around about you. Please call me. I felt sick to my stomach as I gazed at the words. Why now? Why were they trying to find me after all these years? The past is never forgotten. I was wise enough not to succumb to the trick. I blocked the account. But I had trouble sleeping that night. At 3 in the morning, Kendra discovered me sitting on our bathroom floor with trembling hands. Shouting, "They found me." She didn't inquire as to who. She simply sat next to me and pressed her shoulder to mine. She said, "They can't take anything from you that you don't give them." Once I had finally caught my breath again. She was correct. I was no longer that terrified 22-year-old. I had constructed something. And I had no intention of letting them take it away. The unexpected guests 3 days later, my hostess, Maya, called back to the kitchen when I was working the lunch rush at Sunny's East. "Hey, Salvador? There's some family asking for you." I became icy. I considered running for an instant. Rather, I inhaled, wiped my hands on my apron, and went outside. They were there. Banks, my father, was smaller and grayer, but he still had that commanding presence. Irene, my mother, was becoming older, her hands shaking, her face pinching with anxiety. Alan too. At 40, he resembled his father exactly. Same position, the same method of occupying space. A woman I didn't recognize stood next to them. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, and she was leaning back as if she wasn't sure if she belonged there. No one said anything. My heartbeat thumping in my ears took the place of the restaurant noise. At last, Banks called my name. Similar to a query. The pitch, I remained silent. I simply pointed to a vacant table in the corner. We took a seat. They conversed. Mom broke down. Dad gave me his prepared lecture about the importance of family unity. Alan used the "let's move on from the past" tactic. The truth then surfaced. They weren't there to get back together. They needed money, which is why they were there. Dad had heart issues, thus, he had medical bills. No coverage. They had foreclosed on the second house. Alan's company had failed. Some nebulous cryptocurrency scheme that suffered a disastrous failure. Mom had to get knee surgery. They missed me, which is why they weren't searching for me. I was useful, which is why they were searching for me. I gave them space to speak. Allow them to share their carefully crafted sob narrative. Then I asked the one important question. Why now? Suddenly, their masks broke apart. The unexpected response they received. Dad began his nonsense speech by saying that he had always known I'd make something of myself. With a dab at her phony tears, Mom remarked, "We just need a little help, sweetheart." The guilt trip was Alan's first move. "Come on, man. We're family. You wouldn't just leave us hanging, would you?" I folded my arms and reclined in my chair. "Remind me," I called out. "What did you say to me the last time we spoke?" Dad blinked. "What?" I looked him square in the eyes. "It was on my 18th birthday. Do you remember what you told me?" "Nothing." So I reminded him. "At least you can't disappoint me anymore once you're not legally my problem." The quiet was overwhelming. I looked at Mom. Do you remember what you did when he threw away my college acceptance letter? She winced. Nothing, I remarked icily. I then turned to face Alan. And you? Do you remember what you said to my first girlfriend when she came to the house looking for me? Alan shifted in an awkward way. You told her I was probably gay and using her as a cover. His expression clouded. Man, that was years ago. You're really going to hold on to that? I grinned. Yes. I got to my feet. Dinner's at my house tonight. They appeared taken aback. Come, I said. Let's talk properly. Dad nodded, assuming he had already won. Mom wiped away the fictitious tears. Alan grinned. They were unaware of what was about to happen. The Last Supper. They sat drinking coffee in my living room that night, acting like the devoted family they never were. Kendra and the children were upstairs. I gave them time to read their screenplay. Then I left with an envelope in my hand. I gave Banks the item. He pulled it open. His cocky grin disappeared. There was a $73.50 check inside. He raised his head, perplexed. What the hell is this? My back was to the counter. In 2010 it cost precisely $73.50 to take the Greyhound from Grand Junction to our hometown. The precise amount I would have needed to return home after you left me. Quiet. Banks's face then contorted in anger. You ungrateful little, I interrupted him. You wanted to see if I could survive without you? Well, I did. I don't need you. I never did. How could you do this to family? Mom sobbed. Hatred entered Alan's eyes as his mask came off. His wife, Poppy, appeared uneasy. However, I had reached my limit. You need money? Figure it out yourselves. That's what you told me, right? I opened the front door. Goodbye. They rushed out. Disgusted, Banks tossed the check onto my porch. Mom cried. Alan? He gazed at me with blazing, unadulterated jealousy. Then they vanished. I was also at liberty. The finest retaliation. I was standing in the kitchen that night, simply breathing, when Kendra walked downstairs. Her question was, "Are you okay?" I gave a nod. I meant it for the first time in 15 years. That's the problem with retaliation. What you do to them isn't the best sort. It's what you create in their absence. The last farewell after that terrible reunion. I was constantly looking at my phone for a few days. I only wanted to see whether they would try again. Not because I wanted to hear from them. They didn't. There was not even a single phone call. Not even a message. The message had finally reached them. Kendra kept quiet about that evening. She didn't have to. She simply remained near me, providing me with space when I wanted it, but she was always there. She finally said it a week later when we were tidying up after supper, and the children upstairs were getting ready for bed. You did good, Sal. I gave her a look. Yeah? She gave a nod. Yeah. You ended it on your terms. I hadn't considered it in that manner. However, she was correct. I had become the shadow of the boy they left behind for 15 years. I buried him for good that night. Observing from afar, life continued. After that, I didn't give them much thought. However, occasionally my curiosity overcame me. I would scan the local news, LinkedIn, and Facebook groups in my former hometown, merely to observe. Dad's hardware shop never made a comeback. It seemed to me that Mom had finally received government support for her knee surgery. Alan appeared to be the same Alan despite having moved out of state and gotten married again. And me? I had never done better. Another child was born to Kendra and me. We called her Rosie, after my grandma. I had finally taken a break from the daily work to devote myself to my family, after Sonny's had grown to a third location. Our new home was larger, and included a backyard, where the children could run around freely. A typical life. A good life. A final try. It was 5 years later. Then, unexpectedly, I received an email one evening. No subject line. It was just a message from an unfamiliar address. But even before I opened it, I knew who it was. Salvador, I'm not counting on you to respond. I have no idea if you will even read it. However, I wanted to make one final attempt. Dad is no longer with you. It was swift, a heart attack. I figured you might be curious. We have aired. I'm not going to dispute that. We are still your family though. Nothing would make me happier than to see you once more. Mom. I waited to feel something while I sat there and stared at the TV. Fury? Feeling sorry? Sadness? But my only emotion was nothing. I ended the email. I didn't answer. And I didn't hear from them again after that. The finest form of retaliation. I'm occasionally asked if I ever regret it. If I ever consider the possibilities. Should I ever ponder what my life could have been like had I turned back time? Here's the problem, though. Anger isn't the finest form of retaliation. It is not a spectacular instance of winning. Peace prevails. It's waking up beside a woman I love every morning. My children's laughter and the knowledge that their father loves them unconditionally are what provide me joy. It is the presence of happiness, rather than fear in the household. Knowing that I created this life without them, is what it is. And that's sufficient. That is more than sufficient. Because I did more than just survive in the end. I prospered. And retaliation like that never goes away.